Hi, I'm Kate Elliott. This is the November 2022 episode of Narrative Worlds, and I hope I'm in the right month and the right year. Who knows these days? And I am here today with Ursula Vernon, author and illustrator who also writes under the name T. Kingfisher. Her work has won the Hugo, Nebula, I wrote this all down, the Hugo, Nebula, Mythopoeic, Lodestar, and Locus Awards. Am I missing anything?
Modesty forbids.
Okay, then yes, I'm missing more, so go check it out. And I'm delighted to have Ursula here today to talk about not just nobility, everyday life as world building. And I thought a lot about, as I always do, because I overthink and I get anxious about things, is like, how did we want to approach this topic? But I actually wanted to tell the story, which you're going to know immediately, which is how we had known about each other and kind of had that distant acquaintanceship, but we had that moment over the word filbert.
Yes.
Because I grew up in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, and I grew up.
And I also Salem, yes.
I grew up with eating filberts, which I did not find out until I was an adult, that most people call hazelnuts. When I first saw the word hazelnut, I was like, what is that? And then they said, this is what that is. And I said, no, that's not, that's a filbert. And so ever after, I came to understand that filbert was a regional word. And then you used it or recognized that I had used it. I can't remember which. And we were like, we found each other.
Yes, filbert tribe represents.
Yeah, and to me, there's something distinctive in there about the presence of everyday life as world building. Do you want to run with that?
Sure. Yeah. This filbert is a regional common name. Let's say there are people who will tell you there are lots of differences, and that all hazelnuts are hazelnuts, but filberts are hazelnuts, but not all hazelnuts are filberts. I don't know. Forget any of that. The point is, when you live with stuff, people who live around things develop common names for them. Like when we see plants, we don't talk about them and in the Latin. I mean, I do frequently, but they have a common name. So, you're like, that's a petunia, not that's, whatever. That's camphorweed, not Lucia campharana. Common names basically arise when you live with a thing and are familiar with it and have to talk about it. So if you're, in a fantasy world or whatever, there's almost everything is going to have a common name. There'll be some things that won't, I'm sure, and then your character would probably be like, what the hell is that? But one of the confusions that arises when you're dealing with gardening, which I'm a gardener, so we talk about a lot, is my common name and your common name may be the same name, but we're talking about two wildly different plants. So this gets us things where, like, mother of thousands is one term, and that's a type of sedum, and that's also a type of onion. And so one's edible, one's not. So that could be kind of a confusing common name. You find a lot of those where my name for this thing and your name for this thing are the same, but we're talking about two wildly different things. And then you get the problems when you move continents. So like my robins and a European person's robins, wildly different robins, but but American robins were named because they sort of vaguely resembled European robins. I don't know. Anyway. Common
this
names.
Is like the yam and sweet potato issue, right?
Yes, although yams are slightly.
But I think a lot of people they just say, like,
exactly. Yeah,
I don't know what the difference is. I just see them in the store.
Yeah, and that's partly, I think, with potatoes, at least part of it is that we only need one common name for potatoes. We have potatoes and we have sweet potatoes. If you were Inca, you'd have 5,000 names for potatoes because you had 5,000 different varieties of potatoes, which is so. Anyway, agriculture is really important to world building because we're talking about world building, I think, on this thing, and agriculture is always a great place to start. Frankly, what are your characters eating? And don't say stew, like everyone eats stew, bread and stew and cheese. okay, that's very parts of Europe, but there's so many things they could be, and it's not even like all of Europe. If you were in Venice, you'd be eating probably a sort of wheat noodle with chopped salted fish on top. And depending on, where you are and what time of year it is, like everything would be salted. Nothing's ever salted enough in fantasy. It's like, no, really, they salted everything. They had to put it in barrels. They had to preserve it in rendered lard. I mean, when was the last time that someone in fantasy, one of those big feasts that cooks just in there fishing birds that are half-cooked birds out of a barrel of lard? It doesn't come up much.
Well, the sheer range of food that people eat today in other places. I actually, what I'm interested in, as we begin to talk a little bit about agriculture, and you, before we started, you talked about infrastructure, and sometimes, so first of all, I always have to preface everything I say with, write the book you want to write. So
Absolutely.
This information is only for you. It is good insofar it is useful for anyone listening to it. But from my own perspective, and maybe because I grew up in farm country, I sometimes feel like a certain amount of fantasy is written from this perspective of lifestyles of the rich and famous melded with, I grew up in the middle class suburbs where I didn't think about where anything came from or how the infrastructure came to be. Whereas in most societies where people, as you say, are living on the ground in the things, people are very aware of these things all the time. And that as a writer, we have the option, we don't have to make the book about that, but we have the option of building the world around what people know and how they interact with the world around them. Do you have any thoughts?
No, absolutely. It's also to address the thing in chat. Yes, fish stew is okay. If it was fish stew, I would never complain, particularly if they named the fish. It's just everyone goes into the classic medieval tavern and eats the classic medieval stew, because I think it's just like a word that describes, food in general, and you don't have to think about it anymore. Anyway, okay, yes, and I get why people want to talk about the lifestyles of the rich and famous, because you have enough freedom to go do things. You can go off on your adventure or whatnot. And you maybe don't want to spend the whole book wondering where the money is coming from, or stopping the adventure by everybody having to get a part-time job to pay for, the sword to go off to slay the dragon. And I get it. I've done it too. I have certainly written plenty of stories about minor nobility and whatnot. The one that gets me is the farm boys who know nothing whatsoever about farming, or if they don't know anything about farming, they like. If you're a farmer and you're going off on a quest, you would just have this, even a farm boy, you would have this constant running commentary in your head as you walked by everybody else's fields going, you should weed that, or oh, what are you growing? Oh, that's coming in well. Oh man, crops are looking bad. Oh no, water's not good. Yeah. Oh, you let the cows out. Somebody needs to get those back in. And I'm not saying that if you're going to write a farm boy, by God, make him sound like a farm boy, or else make it clear at the beginning he's a terrible farm boy, one of the two. There are so many, it's not necessarily even just the protagonists, because, like I said, I get it. I get why you want to write someone who is not, who can go do the adventure you want to write and not, I am worried about the crops coming in before it rains. But there's so many things that could be fascinating that I think we overlook. For example, one of the great sort of set pieces in the book Perdido Street Station by China Mieville, there's a dock workers strike in this fantasy city. I don't think I had ever read a workers strike, or certainly not a dock strike, but ever read a workers strike in a fantasy novel before that. I was just like, this is amazing. Yes, of course you would have that. Like that, labor strikes are very old. Like zillions of years, and who is working on your docks where your stuff is coming from? Another one is one of the great like cliches is always the princess or the lady who hates embroidering, and that's how she shows that she is not like the other girls. Basically, I hate embroidery. And it's fine if you hate embroidery. Like I'm not going to go shove an embroidery needle into your hand, but embroidery is a complicated art, and it's, you know, it seems frivolous to us now because we have machine embroidery and it could be anywhere. But at the time, it was a way of, you know, adding value, hiding stains in your clothes. Like if your cuffs inevitably wear much quicker than the rest of your clothing, and so okay, you turn them and you embroider over the cuffs so that no one can tell that that's why you did it.
You know,
things like that.
Yeah, I thought about this a lot with my Spirit Walker trilogy, which starts with Cold Magic. And when you first, the heroine is a very impulsive, physical person. She knows how to use a sword. And after I had finished the first draft, I thought about how I wanted, I felt like, I thought to myself, am I falling into that trap where I think that these are the only things that are interesting? So what else is going on in this early 19th century style world? And I thought, you know, we forget, because this is prior to the invention of machine-made cloth, how valuable clothing are, how much time it takes, and how valuable it is to know how to sew, especially if you don't have a lot of money and you can't get everything made bespoke. You can't waltz into the dressmakers because your family has a lot of money and you get all the, you know, there's how many set pieces have we seen of that scene? Which is a fun scene to read and to write, but it's not the reality for most people. So I decided that, of course, all the women in the family, because it's a kind of a society model, well, it's an alternate history, in this part of the world, the women would all know how to sew. And it turned out, especially in book 2, that her ability to sew helped her when she came to a new place. It helped her establish herself because she had a skill that she could use to help people, that she could use to earn money, that was valuable to everyone and to herself. And I think it's important to think, as you said, we think about, you know, do the crops come in? Well, we may not in our society, in modern US society, think of that as a worthy topic of fiction, because we tend to go for the violence. Did someone get murdered? You know, is there a battle yet? Is there an explosion? But in fact, that's existential. Are people going to survive or die? And part of it is our own ability to say what's interesting. What is it about everyday life that makes for dramatic, interesting stories?
And like I wrote a whole novella, Minor Mage, where which is sort of a middle grade. The main character's a kid wizard, and there's a drought, and his village kicks him out and says, "Bring the rain back, or don't come back." And like, so that's basically the call to adventure and inciting incident is there is a drought and the crops are being destroyed, and somebody's got to go get the rain, and you're the wizard, so go. It doesn't matter if you're 12, we're all going to die. So I think a lot of everyday things can absolutely be used as fascinating, inciting incidents. Terry Pratchett was an expert on this, because every like book, you know, was all, let me think about how a system works or a new piece of technology. So you had, you know, going postal was let me think about how a post office would work. And the truth, let me think about the printing press in a fantasy world, which is another thing. Depending on your era, you may not have printing presses, or, you know, you may have the sort of, you know, Gutenberg version, but not movable type. And so, which affects the availability of books. I mean, way too many people in fantasy, frankly, are literate as hell. And which is fine, because you want to relate to them and you're reading a book. So obviously you're probably literate, but, you know, leaving aside audiobooks and other versions. But I wrote a character in once who was one of the protagonists, just illiterate. and that's fine. It doesn't come up. And
I've written a lot. Yeah, I've written a lot about with many major characters who are illiterate because their society wouldn't have, and who function just fine because their society literacy is in this narrow range.
Yeah, it's a skill,
It's a skill like another skill. Like people used to have someone who would write letters.
Yeah.
Isn't that in Victor? Isn't the Victor Hugo? Isn't Victor Hugo have that in which? Where you go to the letter writer, you'd go to the letter writer and they'd write the letter for you, and then it would sent off, and then someone would read it for your family.
Absolutely.
There's a whole level of plot. I mean, I just keep thinking that a lot of plot gets condensed down to there has to be a war, there has to be the rich and famous, or there have to be criminals, and it ignores all the stuff that could be going on that in people's everyday lives that are rich with incident.
Oh yeah, like I'm working on a book right now where I was thinking about salt, and because the pre-refrigeration, the world ran on salt, and the sort of the plot tension is that an artificer, there's an elaborate trade route to deliver salt because that's what happens. And the inciting incident is that an artificer invents basically a desalinating machine. And that's going to destabilize the entire world economy. So we have the people from the trade, conglomerate that controls the trade route are trying to stop it and make sure that technology does not get out. And you have people who are, the Paladin books that I write has a sort of recurring social organization, religion, the Church of the White Rat, or the Temple of the White Rat, they're basically an order of religious social workers. They have lawyers, they set up soup kitchens, things like that. And the bishop in charge is going, I genuinely don't know which way to jump, because when you destabilize the world's economy, a lot of people suffer. But at the same time, some of the people controlling the salt routes are terrible and are grinding the peasantry underfoot. So maybe it would be good. Also, we could personally save a lot of money. This is, So, and that's just over something we all take for granted, salt. There's so many things, like infrastructure, I feel is frequently neglected in fantasy. And so, and you don't need to do everything on the page. It is okay. Like I don't need you to sit down in world building and explain, in the beginning, they built the sewer system here. Like, unless I find sewer systems fascinating, but do some hand waving with enough details thrown in that I'm like, okay, you have at least thought about that. Otherwise, a lot of things start to feel like, if you ever played the game Skyrim, you have this vast spread out world and all these cities, and there are 3 farms that grow cabbages that you can wander into. And apparently that is where all the food for everything comes from, is these 3 farms with cabbages. And I frequently read fantasy novels and start to feel like, there's the farm with the cabbages. And fabric is a huge one. I was gonna say something and then got distracted, but I had a book, Paladin's Grace, I think that was the one, where the hero knits socks, or that's his thing. He sits around and knits socks, because if you don't have good socks and you're a soldier or whatever, your feet fall off. And I wrote a book, Metal and Bone, where where spinning becomes important, and spinning shows up in so many fairy tales, and everyone's like, oh, spinning wheels, right? Okay, burn them all for the in order to save Sleeping Beauty. And do you know what a crisis that would have been for the economy of the kingdom? Because if you don't have any spinning wheels, everyone has to use drop spindles, and I've used a drop spindle for about 30 seconds, and back in the olden days, before the invention of that, practically every family member, as soon as they were old enough to have the coordination to do it, is sitting around with a drop spindle spinning thread like every time they sit down for more than 5 minutes. It's sort of like how knitters always get out their yarn and start working, basically like that,
Yeah.
because you have to have something like 5 people spinning full time to keep one weaver going, just supplied with thread to make enough fabric that, you know, all of your clothes don't fall apart. So
I wonder when people write, I'm always a little cautious. I got to think about how to phrase this. I sometimes feel that when people write based in which their research is mostly other fictional books, that you begin to see that kind of like the photocopy of the photocopy. And that, I guess, one of the things I would always both say to writers and ask other writers is to think about where everything comes from, to think about where things come from in our world that I don't have to deal with getting them. I can just buy them from a store or from Amazon. I don't have to think about all the levels, like you say, as you say, with the drop spindle and the invention of the spinning wheel, which was a massive change. The invention of the shallow plow and then the deep plow, right? Where they could, many people don't realize that we growing up in the Willamette Valley, where you have this deep river soil. In Europe, that area wasn't farmed, didn't begin to get farmed until like the 10th or 11th century, when this deep cutting plow was invented that could cut that heavy soil. They had to put their fields higher up on the hills, which weren't as rich.
Oh yeah.
And what a change that is. But so for writers, I think writers need to like back, if they want to write this kind of book, and if they want to ground what's going on with the people in everyday life, they have to think, what is everyday life? And so, I mean, we both grew up in farm country, so we were surrounded by that. And that has marked me deeply. I look at my earlier book, my earliest things I've written, and it's incredible. There's all this stuff about farms and where the food is coming from. And I wrote my first, technically my second novel, but the first one I completed, which I wrote at 19, starts with a farm boy coming to the city. And I found it. I dug it up recently. I found it. And he's like, they keep horses and he's looking at people's horses and thinking, and his name is based on something about horses. It's never explained, but it's clear that it means something to him and the other guy he's talking to. And I thought, wow, I hadn't realized how deeply that affected me. So what do people do? What do you recommend to writers who say to themselves, I want to know more about infrastructure and the infrastructure of the past? Where do I look for these things? How do I break it down and think about it?
I would start with nonfiction books, and there are some amazing ones. Pick something you're like, food is usually a good one, like, because everybody's got to eat. So start with, what are people eating, and work your way back. Like, okay, fine, let's take stew. Is it a fish stew? As one of our chat people said, okay, you need a fishing, like either an industry, or you need to live in an area like the Pacific Northwest that was so rich in fish that you could live off of the enormous amount of fish. Okay, great. But in order to do that, usually you need overall somewhat smaller population. If you can't just casually plunk London down in the middle there and expect everyone to eat. So, all right, is it beef? Okay, then you have cows, and it's fine to have cows. Cows are fine. Everybody loves cows. Maybe it's mutton stew. You got sheep. That's fine. Everyone's happy. But someone had to get that food to you. And is it just like plain as it is, or are there spices? And spices are where things start to get complicated, because most of us can just be like, okay, there's a farm, there's the city surrounded by farmland, fine, we have cows and bread, yay. Okay, well, spices is where things go bonkers, and a really good book about it that I liked was I have notes and everything. The Taste of Conquest: The Rise and Fall of the Three Great Cities of Spice is a
Oh,
fascinating read. It's
trust me, I got to write that down. Keep
yeah,
going.
it's yeah, it's and I read it's about Venice, Lisbon, and Amsterdam, basically, which made their money on shipping and spice.
Yeah,
And this sort of thing is riveting. Like, at
yeah.
least if you're like me, I'm easily riveted. But by the time I had gotten like a third of the, gotten 2 chapters in, I was like, oh, that's a plot. Oh, that's a book. Okay, that's an entire book right there. And that's the problem. You start reading nonfiction, you're just like, oh, I could write a whole book about that. Cosmetics, the history of cosmetics is unfreaking believable. There's a really good book called the Art of Beauty. I want to say, let me look that one up.
I
Uh,
want to, while you're looking that up, I want to kind of amplify what you're saying, which is that thinking that there's these limited number of plots that are going to be acceptable to readers I think does readers a disservice. And I know that the publishing industry can be restrictive in some ways, but that I really believe that reading history, and either history as history, these guys and gals went here and these people went here and did that, right? That's one form, but also the form of history as everyday life and the history of material culture. So how did the food, how were trains invented, and what were the early trains? Or what is the history of cosmetics? When did people first start changing themselves?
oh, and my God,
And there's so much story involved if you look between those places.
oh yeah, like I can't find it now, but I read this amazing book about it was the history of cosmetics, and it starts with perfuming. And
Mhm.
perfume, like, and I wound up, and I literally did write a whole book about that. Which was Paladin's Grace, which the hero is a perfumer. But it started because I'm reading about all of this, and like when incense and tree sap is being harvested, there was at least one town where the town had a very strict control on uh, the sap of the trees from the sacred, okay, not sacred, probably, for the extremely commercially viable grove. And they worked out that basically you could go and harvest from the trees, and families would own specific trees that you were allowed to go harvest those trees. But when you came back, there was one road to the grove and one road back, and they had archers stationed there. And if your wagon deviated off that road, they'd shoot you, because then you were probably smuggling and not giving the town its cut. And so I'm like, that's a whole fantasy heist novel right there.
Absolutely. That's an
Yeah,
amazing detail.
yeah, exactly. Or for years or centuries, human fat was an ingredient in cosmetics, and executioners made part of their money by selling it to cosmeticians, to basically perfume and makeup makers from the corpses that they made, essentially. And if someone didn't claim a body, you kind of like took the bits and sold them off to it was a perk of the job, was
Yeah,
you sold
yeah.
fat, which was used as a filler in cosmetics, and along with white lead, which of course, because this is also the era of smallpox, so you need a really deep filler for the scarring left behind by some of that. And then of course, if you're using white lead, you get even worse scarring, so then you
Yes,
need
I know.
even
I'm
more
thinking like,
elaborate
oh,
things.
okay.
Yeah, it's all very terrible. But just stuff like, and then in perfuming, like for ages, leather is a huge one. How do you treat leather? And we don't even think about it, because of course leather smells like leather. It's nice. For centuries, leather stank, because in order to preserve it, you had to use this horrible ammonia kind of solution, and it was dreadful. It involved a lot of urine, frankly, and
Yeah.
it was you didn't want that. So when someone in like the 14th century invented what was called Spanish leather, which didn't stink, and there were a lot of perfumes sort of added to it, it was a game changing thing. And then the problem was that because perfumers were involved in the process, and also this was Venice and the Medicis got involved, there were all of these rumors that people were giving poisoned gloves to their rivals, that when you put them on, the gloves would leach a poison into your blood, because of course the Medicis, and so perfumers were treated with extreme suspicion for a long time because they might be poisoners. And which also, they're sitting around, double distilling things with alembics and steam and whatnot. So that looks like weird shit to the layperson.
Looks like alchemy or magic, right?
Exactly.
And,
so you might be a witch and you were probably questionable. And a lot of them were questionable people. Like there was at least one fairly well-known perfumer whose sideline was helping the women of Rome become widows. And so you would go in and ask her for the special perfume or whatever, and she would tell you to put a couple drops in your husband's tea, and that was the end of the matter. So it's
history.
Fabulous.
History is what I always say, and not. I think that we got stuck. I think a lot in the U.S. the way history is taught in schools is not well, and it focuses on this thing, order of events, right, with a few people. And so it's like, why read history? It's just going to be this order of events and a timeline. And I guess I got to make one for my story, maybe, or maybe not. But in fact, history is incredible. And it's a great basis for writing. For writing a story. I want to quickly break in and say, if anyone wants to ask a question, put it in the Q&A and we will answer it. But don't put it in chat, because I'm not looking at chat because I can't multitask, unlike some exceptional people. I don't have that thing, but put it in the Q&A. We would love your questions. But I want to ask you, it's so rich and there's so much, and I'm a terribly dense world builder, which is good and bad. But you are, as an illustrator, I'm curious to know, there's got to be an interaction for you between illustration and prose, but my particular interest is the visual act of backgrounding. So when you illustrate a story in a graphic novel, you have to decide what to put in the background, and how much has that played into how you world build in prose? Because I always put in too much. Like, I want to describe everything, but as an illustrator, you can't do that, right? You can have like one panel that's like really rich, but people are also, it's a different process. So I'm interested to hear how those two interact in terms of how you get the world building across to the reader in prose.
Well, the two are weirdly dissimilar in my brain, because I think usually what happens is that I write the script first, and then writer me writes the script, and artist me is like, you put this in a cathedral and now you want me to draw the cathedral. I hate you forever. So honestly, I wish I could say that there was some deep depth of I will put in bean vines in the background of this scene because whatnot, but actually what usually happens is it's what's going to be easy to draw 500 times over and over again.
So this is like the Faulkner thing where they said, what's the meaning of the nasturtiums in the windowsill box? And he said, oh, they were what was outside my window when I was writing that scene. It doesn't have any deep scene about, it doesn't have any thematic content.
No, most of the time in graphic novels, it's bushes, caves, and trees are easy to draw. Buildings are hard. So when I was doing Digger, a lot of things take place in the woods, underground, whatnot. If I have to do it in a building, I get annoyed and do a lot of close-up shots. Sorry.
No, but this is interesting, though. I find, because one of the things about everyday life as world building is that we get into that balance, right? We need that balance between enough world building. If there's too little world building, it could be set anytime, anywhere.
Yep.
And oftentimes, because world building is going to include material culture, but it's also going to include social space and social interaction. And if someone isn't thinking, if a writer isn't thinking deeply about how people interact socially, they're going to have, like, I always use this example, at the end of the Disney cartoon Mulan where she hugs the emperor. Like, really? Right? That would just simply never happen in contextually in that culture. So if someone isn't thinking that much about the social space and the interaction, and someone can just march into the palace and say whatever to the king, if it's not set up that that's something that people can do, you're not going to do that to Louis the 14th, right? That's just never going to happen. And then there's not much material culture either. Then these stories could be set anywhere. They could be modern. They could be, Roman Empire. They could be Middle Ages if there's no context. But too much context, it gets bogged down. Yeah, too much context, it gets bogged down. It's like, why do you need 3 sentences describing everything that's on the desk when you really only need to know that there's, the writing implement, what it is? Can you? Yes.
I tend actually to write fairly, I want to say, lean at the beginning. I don't do too many huge descriptions. Part of that may be that that I didn't have to describe things very much when writing graphic novels. Part of it may just be the way I go. But yeah, there is a interchangeability, and that is why I think we have a lot of problem with generic extruded fantasy product. Is it's all set in the sort of vague fantasy version of Western Europe circa Middle Ages, medieval-ish, but also there's some Renaissance thrown in so that we have some cool stuff to do during the battles and things like that. Like one suggestion I would have for people who are trying to figure out, how to incorporate this, if you're writing a timeline of your world, is it battles or put some inventions in there? Put when, because like when the cotton gin of all things was invented, which was a vocabulary word for most of us in history class, and I don't think any of us have thought about the cotton gin in a million years, or the spinning jenny or whatever, that completely revolutionized everything. That was the start of industrialization, with steam powered fabric creation. If something like that comes in, suddenly you have vast out of work numbers of out of work peasants, and also cloth is suddenly cheap and everything has changed. So put in some inventions, and it doesn't have to be an industrialization one. It can be the deep plow or whatever, but so many timelines are just here is where the this battle and this battle and this battle, whereas if you're going back to like Rome or whatever, the point where the aqueduct was invented or the Roman roads has a huge knock-on effect with everything. So inventions. Also, one of the things that almost never gets dealt with is if you think of civilization as founded on water, it's basically 2 questions: where do we get the water from, and how do we get rid of the fouled water? Most of civilization can be narrowed down to plumbing. How do you get rid of sewage and trash? And how do you get fresh water in? Which, I mean, food, yes, but food is much easier to ship over long periods, over long spaces than water is, which is why the aqueduct was such a game changer for everything. So, I mean, figure out why your village, where is your city getting its water? What are they doing with the wastewater? And I'm not saying you need to build the whole book around the sewage systems. Someday I'm going to write a fantasy romance that is built entirely around sewage systems. I've been threatening to do that for ages.
I know you. I'm now requiring it. Sorry, you have to do it now because I think that's an amazing and perfect. I want to add to writers that you think it's worrisome to think because people will say, some readers will say, there was just too much information, but there's 2 specific things writers can do. Is one, you think about that one detail that tells you what you need to know, as opposed to the 5 details, right? So sometimes it's just, are your soldiers, I can't talk, Are your soldiers carrying rifles, muskets, or swords? Right? That tells you something about what level of technology you have. Are they wearing plate, or are they wearing mail, or are they wearing leather or some other lamellar armor? I mean, or no armor. I mean, there's a lot you can tell us just with a detail like that. And then you talked about this earlier with the farm boy coming to the city or whatever, and how he looks, or he or she or they look at the world. Use your point of view characters to notice things that they would notice because of their understanding of the world. And that is like the best way to get a huge amount of world building across, because the person they're walking with might not notice those things. And then they have a reason to notice them. And then it isn't so much like I'm just info dumping that information onto the reader. There's a plot and character dependent reason why it's involved in the plot.
Absolutely, and you can tell all things about the kinds of things about the character based on what they notice, and are they very responsible, and that they're like, oh God, I should go pull that weed. No, wait, not my farm, can't go pull the weed, or they're like, haha, you have weeds, you're gonna suck. On the subject of toilets, this reminds me that we are often very guilty of a very westernized view of using the bathroom. In Rome, you were all in one room. Business meetings could be held in the toilet. Like it was, big communal toilets, bathhouses, same way. There were large baths. You'd go, you'd bathe, and you conducted business. And it was like, I can't think of the last fantasy I read where people are hanging out in a bath and conducting business.
Charlemagne would hold council meetings in the Roman baths at or whatever, because they were still around. That reminds me of the whole early medieval people were dirty. Actually, as long as they were still functional Roman baths, people used them if they had access to them. It's really the Renaissance and the early modern where people start getting dirty,
Yeah, and people also, like, they washed. No, they did not necessarily have a full immersion bathtub, but they washed, like, as Granny Weatherwax would say, I wash all the bits as and when they become available. So but laundry is a whole issue. Not everyone has a laundry machine. That there is a reason that people had that laundresses were a huge thing, because you had to give the clothes to someone to wash. And if you didn't have that many suits of clothes, because frankly a lot of people did not, you had to come up with ways to keep them from stinking. And like there were whole groups who would smoke the clothes, basically, so you always smelled very strongly of smoke, but the smoke smelled a lot different than sweat or whatnot. And it also kept the bugs out. No one's ever got enough lice in medieval fantasy. I'm not fixing that. That's a bridge too far. But and so a little infrastructure goes a long way. Like you don't have to, walk me through every stage in the process. I mean, Pratchett he would make it hilarious along the way. Like I think it's Night Watch, where they close the city gates and there's like hundreds of wagons full of eggs and livestock and whatnot, who are like, we got to get through here. Like this comes into the city every single day. And what am I supposed to do with this massive wagon of eggs? But just even if you just use one, like pick one thing and show me you've thought about that in any kind of depth, and it is almost a sort of, you have established your writerly credentials, and I am like, yep, okay, I believe it. If whereas if everybody is wearing silk, I'm like, okay, where are the silkworms? Do you have a trade route with a country that has silkworm environment and has a silk trade and has mulberry groves and has a populace and whatnot? So it's just give me one or two things. Also, don't mess with the textile people. The textile people, I love them and they're terrifying. So if you have it is okay for initial forays into world building to be like agriculture or sewage or spice or something, because you start getting into textiles, and if you do it well, they will start asking you intense questions because they think you got it right. Like, oh, so tell me about this. Did you make this up? Where is this from? This is fascinating. I haven't heard of this. And if you get it wrong, they will send you these very polite, pleasant emails, not in anger, but in sorrow. And yeah.
You know, but many years ago, when I was writing the Geron books, and I had a very kind friend who said, you know, you're treating your horses like motorcycles. And I'm like, oh, I am. But anyway, that aside, so, you know, think about, no, hold on. I don't want to talk about horses. I've been speaking of the textile people, this is not about. So my dad, before he passed, read all my books. And he was so proud of me and so kind and everything. And then one day, I don't know what we were talking about. And he goes, you know, the oxen are yoked wrong. And I'm like, oh my God. So anyway, I don't know what I had said, but it's like literally a phrase it's one sentence, a phrase in a sentence, but I had referred somehow to it, and it was the what you put on horses. And I was just, oh no, right? So I think that's one of the things that may be scary to people. But I think it's okay to make mistakes because you learn from your mistakes. And the reality is, if you're willing to learn, if you're trying your best to do something and you get something wrong and someone tells you, then you don't repeat that mistake. And I think that's a better outcome for me anyway, than to never put in any details and treat it as if it's like this generic, almost suburban medieval Disney Hollywood, right? I would rather the mistake, because we can get through that. We can change that the next time it appears in another volume. But if there's nothing, then where do you go with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And on the oxen thing, I actually have an ox consultant because I had an ox team in a book, and my friend who has a pair of oxen read the entire thing, was like, nope, not here. No, they did not do that. All right, no, note here. But the thing is, you're going to get one reader who has oxen. You're going to get 50,000 who know horses. So get the horses right, or just don't use horses. Like, horses are big and require a lot of maintenance, and they eat a lot. And they're like, if you have to get fast from one place to another, sure. But if you're just walking, you can just walk. It's okay. You don't necessarily need to carry a horse with you, or a horse. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. Lot. If it's a small horse, you can put it over your shoulder.
But there's a running joke that in my books that I hate horses, and because my characters are always saying like derogatory things about horses. I admit I was scraped off on a tree at the age of 12 and have been slightly bitter ever since. But
the other thing is if you feel that you have good reasons to need a horse, like say you have a messenger service and they run on horses, then, and you're not sure about how to deal with your horses, then there's also ways to, as you said, focus on the things you do know. And let that kind of be, make sure you don't make any egregious mistakes. Leave it a little fuzzy and highlight the things you do know. So they ride to the next stage. And at the next stage, you know something about leather, or you know something about the food that's being, or the dye, someone's making dye in the back because there's some kind of plant there that I don't know, whatever. But you can juggle these things so that the stuff.
And also, I will add that if you don't know, there are a wealth of people in the world who are delirious with joy to be asked. I go on Twitter and I'm like, Twitter brain trust. I need to know. My last horror novel, I'm like, what kind of pistol does a Austro-Hungarian soldier in 1890 who use, and they're out of the military and they don't have a lot of money, but they were an officer beforehand. And like, the gun enthusiasts are possibly the only people to exceed the textile enthusiasts. I just filled up with, okay, you want the, the Austrian 1879, I can't remember the name now, and I'm not going to say it because otherwise we'll get emails, but I immediately had links to pictures. I had people debating the guns. I'd say it'd either be this one or this one. I had videos being sent to me of people firing them. So I'm like, wow, there's a lot of smoke that comes off that thing.
Detail. Yeah.
And so people are delighted to be asked about the thing they care about so much. And most of them are frankly used to you getting it wrong and will sigh, but they will be so happy if you get it right.
Yes, absolutely. I'm just going to say we have just a few minutes left. If anyone has a question, drop it into the Q&A. Let me see. Move through, I wrote here, moving through life without furniture. And by furniture, I mean the world. That to me, that as a reader, that's one of the most disappointing things I find in a story, when I feel that there's nothing, there, that people are disembodied, that they're not really, the world is almost virtual reality, which is fine for a story, but it's a different kind of story.
Yeah, and I would say think about definitely research that is not other fantasy novels, but and I am guilty of this. Okay, why is their travel delayed so they don't get there on time? All right, well, the wagon gets stuck in the mud or there's a storm or whatnot. All right, but that's been done a million times. What if there is a dock strike and no one can get across the river? And, and so they're stuck there for 3 days because nobody's taking you across the river, and they either have to bribe someone to cross the picket line or get smuggled, or they just wait. What they choose to do will tell you about who they are as people as well. And it's a good, there are lots of, plot is basically the process of throwing problems in the way of your characters, and we tend to throw so many of the same problems. We throw the bandits, and we throw the storm, and we throw the war and whatnot. There are so many good problems you can throw in. Throw in a plague that, like, this is a plague town, and they're just going to shoot you if you walk up because you might be infected. Or
in Crown of Stars, I got in ergo. Is that?
Yes. Ergot poisoning.
Ergot. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Right.
ERGOT. It's a mildew that grows on barley. Rye. I wrote this a long time. Rye. Thank you. And I got that right. I know I got it right. It's a mildew, and it gives people, among other things, hallucinations. And I worked it into the story because it was a real danger in the Middle Ages.
There's actually a great theory that the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Rome were that their sacrament was ergotized beer. It was beer made with the rye that had infected with ergot.
Get those, right?
Yeah. So
there's a lot. There's so much. The world is so rich that it always feels to me like we can use it, and we don't have to use all of it. As you said, pick one thing, and then a secondary thing. You don't have to try to do it all, but even finding that richness of the physical world and the everyday life creates, I think, books that are richer.
Absolutely. Like, I still remember the scene in Perdido Street Station with the dock workers strike, because I'd never seen that anywhere else. And there are much worse things that you can do in your novel than have something where everybody goes, I've never seen that used in a fantasy novel before. But of course it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a great place to end. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Filberts forever. Filberts forever. And I will add that the next Narrative Worlds will be December 18th, same time, same place. And it's going to be Zoraida Cordova and Danielle Clayton, who are going to talk about world building for middle grade and young adult.
Woo!
Yeah, I know. I'm really excited. Again, I can't thank you enough for being here. And I want to thank, as always, CJ, who is our events tech coordinator today, Nathan Lucas, Kate Baker, and everyone at SFWA and the Nebula Conference who has offered this platform. And thank you, all of those of you who attended today, and those of you who are seeing this on the YouTube channel later. Thank you so much.